In Mosby, gray ghost of the Confederacy, mounting the stars. There was always a welcome for the lean partisan leader at the home of such a Virginia gentleman as Lorman Chancellor. In Chancellor's pleasant brick house, even the servants could be trusted. Mosby came early or late, always sure of a meal or a bed. He had been at Chancellor's when he first learned that Sir Percy Wyndham was coming after him. In Loudoun County, not far from Middleburg and the road south to Fauquier County and Warrenton, it was a good central place for his operations. So, on March 8th, he again had good food and pleasant talk at Mr. Chancellor's house. He showed excitement only as he was about to ride away. "I shall mount the stars tonight," he suddenly told his host, "or sink lower than plummet ever sounded." Then he wheeled off to the meeting with his men, remembering as he rode the motto, "Adventures to the adventurous." Before the night was over, he was to have adventures which afterwards he could only describe with the help of a variety of literary and historical references. We'll see what that means in a little bit, little buddies. There seemed nothing bookish about him, however, as he reined up at his rendezvous with 29 of his rangers. Tonight, he was not waiting for Wyndham. He was going to get him. His plans were not exactly new. Nearly a month before, he had written Jeb Stuart that the cavalry on the federal outposts around Washington could be captured. Now he wanted the Yank cavalry's British commander, who had called him a horse thief. He had told his plans for the night only to Big Yankee James. There was no longer any question in the minds of Mosby or any of his men about trusting Ames. The partisan leader said later that he never understood what Ames's motives were in deserting to him. And he added, "I never cared to inquire." He could trust him. Now Ames, with the secret of the Rangers' mission, had been out scouting. It seems probable that in the week before this gathering of the band, the big Yankee had been in Fairfax Courthouse looking around, asking quiet questions. Colonel Wyndham and his headquarters there, near the more elaborate ones of rich, sociable young Brigadier General Stoughton, commander of the brigade defending the capital. Certainly Ames had discovered that there was a break in the Yankee picket lines around Fairfax Courthouse. The gray-headed Underwood, who knew every path, led Mosby's men through the break, across the melting snow and in the evening mist. A drizzling rain helped shelter them, and once the picket line was passed without sign of a sentinel, Mosby felt that half of the game was won. It was not quite that simple. Mosby had planned to reach Fairfax Courthouse by midnight so as to get out of the Yankee lines by dawn. Some of his men got lost. His little column was broken in the dark. An hour passed while his band looked for each other. After they closed up, they struck the highway between the village of Centerville and Fairfax Courthouse. Then, 2 or 3 miles from the courthouse, they entered the woods to avoid the camps of Wyndham's cavalry. By the railroad station, they slipped into the quiet town. In the pitch dark, which hid the color of their uniforms, Mosby established his headquarters out in the courthouse yard. All telegraph wires were cut. Sentinels were shown the business ends of big revolvers. Mosby detailed squads to go to the stables and the officers' quarters. Ames and others were sent to get Wyndham, for whom they had come. Big Yankee came back with some of Wyndham's officers, but the bad news that the gentleman was safe in Washington. Then, as the squads gathered up prisoners and horses, Mosby learned that General Stoughton was sleeping at his headquarters in the 2-story brick Gunnell house. And he was probably sleeping soundly, too, because he had had a big gay party earlier in the evening. Taking 5 or 6 men, the partisan leader galloped to the house. They dismounted and knocked loudly on the door. "Who's there?" a voice demanded. Mosby answered, "5th New York Cavalry with a dispatch for General Stoughton." The door was opened by a lieutenant in his nightclothes. The chief raider grabbed the officer by his nightshirt, whispered his name in his ear, and demanded that he take them to Stoughton's room. The young officer looked at the barrel of the remorseless revolver, as the raider called his gun. He obeyed. By a light which they quickly lit in the room to which the officer took them, they saw the general huddled in the covers, snoring loudly. Dispensing with ceremony, Mosby jerked off the bedclothes, pulled up the general's nightshirt, and spanked him soundly on the bear behind. "Get up, General, and come with me," he ordered. The Yankee commander sat up, outraged. "What is this? Do you know who I am, sir?" Mosby grinned. "I reckon I do, General. Did you ever hear Mosby?" "Yes," said Stoughton eagerly. "Have you caught him?" "Nope, but he has caught you." The general glared. "What's this all about?" "It means, General," said Mosby calmly, "that Stuart's cavalry have taken over Fairfax and General Jackson is at Centerville." That was a big multiplication of Mosby's 29 men, but it served the purpose. "Is Fitz Lee here?" Stoughton demanded. The raider nodded. "Then take me to him. I knew him at West Point." Pleased as he was with his captive, Mosby was disgusted with him, too. He smelled of the wine he had drunk that evening. Mosby had heard that the young officer was a brave soldier, but a fop. Now with distaste he watched him dress. Later he could only describe this scene by referring to some of his strange book lore, which always seemed odd in a two-gun ranger. "He dressed before a looking-glass," Mosby said, "as carefully as Sardanapalus did when he went into battle." Probably none of Mosby's men had ever heard of that last, most effeminate and corrupt of the kings of Assyria. They knew what their leader expected, however. When he brought Stoughton down, the guards he had left at the door had all of the general's horses and couriers rounded up. At the courthouse meeting place, the other squads were waiting. There were 3 times as many prisoners as raiders, and each was mounted, leading another horse. Now, the great problem was how to escape with the spoils. As they were leaving town, an officer in a loud voice from a window demanded what the cavalry was doing in the street. The raiders laughed loudly, and Mosby sent some of them to catch the man. They broke through the door, but met there a lady fighting like a lioness. She was the wife of the shouting officer in the window, who turned out to be Colonel Robert Johnstone, the commander of the cavalry during Wyndham's absence. Mrs. Johnstone held the raiders off until her husband could run naked from the house to hide somewhere in the garden behind it. The laughing Rebs always insisted that he hid under a privy. That's an outhouse. That's an outdoor bathroom. They did not have time to look long for the naked officer, wherever he was. Daybreak was coming soon. Roosters began to crow as they reached the pike 4 miles from Centerville. They were fearful that Yankee cavalry would be coming after them. Then at Centerville they saw the campfires of other Federal troops. Fortunately, their pickets had been withdrawn as dawn approached. They could see cannon bristling on the redoubts, and a sentinel shouted at them to halt. Apparently, however, he concluded that they were a body of Yankee soldiers. Beyond the camps, they came to a little stream called Cub Run. Hey, I've crossed Cub Run before. The stream was ordinarily easily fordable, but the melting snow had turned it into a torrent. Still with the enemy in full view behind them, they had to go on. Mosby plunged in first, and his horse swam to the other bank. Stoughton followed and came out shivering. "Captain," he said, "this is the first rough treatment I have to complain of." Mosby laughed and turned to more of his bookishness to express his feeling in terms of the poetry of Robert Burns. "I knew that there was no danger behind us," he declared, "and that we were as safe as Tam O'Shanter thought he would be if he crossed the bridge of Doon ahead of the witches." The whole population turned out to cheer them as they passed Warrenton. Across the Rappahannock, Mosby delivered his prisoners to the Confederate officer he most disliked, Fitzhugh Lee. As apparently the Yankee general had expected, Lee was very polite to him. Later, Fitzhugh Lee even tried to have Stoughton quartered in a hotel in Richmond instead of a prison. But he treated Mosby with indifference. He did not ask the Ranger leader to take a seat by the fire. What Mosby had done did not seem to impress Lee. "The reception I received," Mosby declared, "convinced me that I was not a welcome person at those headquarters. So, bidding the prisoners goodbye and bowing to Fitz Lee, I rode off in the rain to the telegraph office to send a report to General Stuart." He did not have to wait for Stuart to receive his wire. That great, gay general came into Culpeper that evening, loud in his praise of John and his feat. John never forgot the joy Stuart showed when he met him at the railroad station. Stuart clearly felt that Mosby had mounted the stars. Yet Mosby had been hurt by Fitzhugh Lee's treatment of him. He was not as gracious as he ordinarily would have been about a commission as captain which Stuart brought from the governor of Virginia. The Ranger even questioned its validity, since all Southern forces were now part of the Army of the Confederacy. "I want no recognition," he told Stuart. He meant, he said later, official recognition. He liked, he admitted, public praise as much as any other man. The generous Stuart understood his old scout snappishness and quickly published a general order almost singing about Mosby's, quote, "boldness, skill, and success so signally displayed in his numerous forays upon the invaders of his native soil," unquote. He hailed the raiders' last brilliant exploit as a feat unparalleled in the war. Finally, the great cavalryman spread his praise to Mosby's gallant band, worthy of such a leader. John's resentment disappeared. He was not even troubled when, as he thought, Fitzhugh Lee tried again to deprive him of a command. Lee could never do that now. Perhaps Fitz Lee needed the men he tried to get back from Mosby. Certainly, in the growing shortage of good horses in the Confederacy, he needed the Yankee mounts Mosby had brought. In that same month, when Fitzhugh Lee fought brilliantly in a cavalry fight at Kelly's Ford on the Rappahannock, no one better than himself understood his disadvantage. Guarding Robert E. Lee's flank, Fitz Lee's brigade had 2,100 men on its rolls, but for lack of horses he could only mount 800 men. Before Mosby's Rangers rode back to their raiding ground, their captain presented General Stoughton's beautiful saddle to his beloved Stuart. Stuart sent his thanks, and also a request about pretty Antonia Ford, who had been arrested as a spy after Mosby's Fairfax raid. "I wish you would send me," said Stuart, "whatever evidence you may be able to furnish of Miss Ford's innocence of the charges of having guided you in your exploits at Fairfax, so I can insist upon her unconditional release." Mosby was always glad to help damsels in distress, particularly damsels who had helped him. His evidence of the innocence of Antonia was not available. She was kept in the old Capitol prison for some months. Washington was pretty grim about Mosby and anybody who might help him. Apparently, only the greatest Yankee saw any light side to his exploit at Fairfax. When President Lincoln was informed of the loss in the raid, a brigadier general and 58 horses, the Union president shook his head. "Well, I'm sorry for that," said Lincoln. "I can make new brigadier generals with a scratch of the pen, but I can't make horses." And not all the Union generals they had could keep Mosby's Rangers from snatching their horses.